The Belt and Road Initiative has been a boon for some and a curse to many others. My friends, if someone offers you a deal that is simply too good to be true, or seems to be that way, should you trust it? What if this offer would seemingly help the vast majority of your country's people? What if this offer would promise to bring your country rapidly into the 21st century? And what if those who offered this deal to you knew that you were not going to be able to actually pay it back, thereby giving them leverage against you and leaving you in a weaker position? Well, my friends, that is what we are going to be discussing in today's video. We are going to be talking about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and we're going to be sorting through some of the facts in order to try and figure out whether this thing is simply the latest evolution of global trade, or perhaps something that is a newer form of economic imperialism and neocolonialism. Join me, my friends, as we talk about the history of what is easily one of the most complex geopolitical issues to face the modern era. And to do so, we're going to need to go back in time and talk about context. So imagine this. It is the year 2013 and Chinese President Xi Jinping has just taken office. At this moment, he is visiting Central Asia and meeting with leaders of the countries that is along the path of the legendary Silk Road of centuries past. At the time, he was not exactly expected to make any serious waves, and it seemed to everyone that this was just a standard preliminary meeting of world leaders that would have to work together going forward. Only to shock the world in September of 2013 while visiting Kazakhstan, where he would decide to announce the largest infrastructure project of all time. Now, for those of you who aren't exactly familiar with it or haven't seen anything in the news or any other kind of geopolitical videos, China's Belt and Road Initiative is something that has been in the process of being built ever since that moment in Central Asia over a decade ago, and is now considered to be the largest construction project in history, like as in the history of the entire world. The sheer number and scope of projects that would take place or were proposed to take place as a result of this initiative is insane. And in order to try and understand this, considering the sheer amount of things that we're going to be talking about, it's important that we go back and kind of assess the progress of all the varying different projects and their results. Good or bad. Because there have been many channels when talking about the Belt and Road Initiative that specifically focus on the positives or the negatives, one or the other, but they don't necessarily look at the entire thing as one massive conclusive project. And that's what we're going to be doing here today. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So first off, Belt and Road, or BRI. This would be an ambitious plan to develop two new different types of trade routes that would connect China with the rest of the world. But the initiative was more than just about infrastructure and trade. It was specifically an effort, a massive geopolitical effort, to develop and expand independent markets for China, to grow China's economic and political power, and to create the right conditions for China to be able to build a high-technology economy. Not something where China would just be dependent upon simple manufacturing, but something that would build an interconnected, massive economy that would be dependent upon China for massive technological goods. And so it was then that the BRI would be launched in 2013 as the New Silk Road, something that would expand Chinese exports of infrastructure as well as goods and services. Among many different ambitions, China would hope that this initiative would increase their own trade networks, their diplomatic relations, and further strategic goals with the surrounding nations, and in essence, China would seek to make itself and its resources and its distribution networks incredibly vital and essential for any developing countries in the region to be able to operate and do business going forward with the rest of the 21st century. And to put this into wider context, we've already mentioned on this channel before how the current period of time, or at least what we have been in for the last 30 years or so, has essentially been China's Industrial Revolution era. Just as the United States and the UK would grow their reach to become suppliers to the world in the 19th century, China hopes to replicate this for themselves today and make surrounding nations dependent upon them. If you want to look at this from another perspective, the BRI almost evokes echoes of the post-World War II Marshall Plan that the US had carried out to both rebuild Europe, but also to gain influence in the varying different countries of Europe to try and prevent the spread of communism in the new post-war world of the time. But for China, though, it's not so much an idea of trying to spread communism or anything like that, or stop something else. It's more so the idea of being able to spread the influence of the Chinese Communist Party, of specifically making other nations dependent upon China and giving them their own kind of big brother outlook on things. The second key reason for the initiative, if any of you have seen the previous video that I did on the problem with America and its own housing crisis, well, that would be the legacy of the 2008 financial crisis. China's government would specifically respond to the emergency with a $4 trillion yuan stimulus package, something that would issue contracts to build railways, bridges, airports, anything and everything that you can imagine on a truly insane level. This, of course, was going to have the unintended side effect of oversaturating the Chinese market in the process. We've already covered in a previous video as to why the Chinese economy is kind of a lie, and with such a great dependency upon specifically the building of infrastructure, the Belt and Road Framework is something that would be necessary to provide a crucial alternative market for China's vast state-owned companies beyond the borders of China. And finally, among all of these, and perhaps one of the most important, the Belt and Road Initiative is something that is seen as a crucial element in the Chinese government's effort to actually stimulate the economies of the country's western and northern border provinces. These are areas which historically have lagged behind the richer coastal areas, the places that would balloon into massive cities to be able to produce massive amounts of products, and from that serve as the financial and manufacturing hub of the entire country. In order to maintain their power within the country, one of the key things that the Chinese Communist Party has to do is try to relocate some of the wealth that is on the east and bring it further west. After all, if everyone is equal, you can't have things be too unequal. The government specifically uses the Belt and Road in order to encourage and support businesses in these landlocked central regions, allocating budgets generously and encouraging businesses to compete for Belt and Road contracts. So because of that, my friends, remember as that we are going forward in this video and really explaining what the BRI is and what it has done for the parties involved, just remember here at the start that I have mentioned and will mention that the project is doing some good things for a number of the countries that are involved, including within some of these border provinces of China. But the results of the entire project have been a bit of a mixed bag. And allow me to explain what it is that I mean. In the year 2014, Xi Jinping would outline plans to expand the initial vision of the BRI and to additionally establish new sea trade infrastructure along the old Marco Polo route. This being a maritime Silk Road that would connect China to Southeast Asia, Africa, and Europe, and this would be a longer route that would avoid the Malacca Strait, incorporating fueling stations, ports, bridges, industry, and infrastructure all throughout Southeast Asia and well into the Indian Ocean. Looking at it on a closer level, the BRI covers 5 integrative routes that consist of 3 land routes and 2 maritime routes. The land routes go and connect China and Western Europe through Central Asia, the Middle East, and Russia. Meanwhile, the maritime routes would link the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or UNESCAP, would summarize the 6 economic corridors that bond China and almost the rest of the world as such. You have the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar route, or the BCIM, the China Indochina Peninsula, or ICP, the China Central West Asia, or CAWA, the New Eurasian Land Bridge, or NELB, the China-Mongolia-Russia route, or the CMR, and, of course, the China-Pakistan, or CP, economic corridor. By observing these varying different corridors, it can be seen that one of the other principal objectives of the BRI is to improve its connectivity between China and the Eurasian region countries by developing infrastructure and trade cooperation in the form of free trade zones, which we are going to discuss here in just a second. In order to support the implementation of the BRI, the Chinese government had established 3 different financial organizations, namely the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, the BRICS Development Bank, which is also something that we're probably going to need to talk about in the future, specifically with BRICS and its competition with other different financial forces, and lastly, the Silk Road Fund. Looking at these, the AIIB is a multilateral development bank that is based in Beijing, China, that would specifically focus on financing infrastructure investment in the Asian region. It was launched in 2016 and would serve more than 50 different countries, including Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea. The BRICS Development Bank would be established by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa in order to support infrastructure investment projects in those respective countries. The Silk Road Fund, on the other hand, this would be the fund that would be coming from joint Chinese state-owned banks in order to promote BRI implementation. It should be noted that China's National Development and Reform Commission, or the NDRC, this is the agency that is in charge of implementation of these funds in regards to the BRI. So, okay, we've gone over a little bit of the finances. Great, awesome. But now what we're going to have to do is go over some of the countries that have been most affected by the BRI and what that project has actually done for them, whether good or bad. Mind you, when we go and talk about this, this is not going to be an exhaustive list of every single project. If I did that, this would not be a hour-long video or so. This would be a 10-hour video at least. But I'm going to give you the general idea of what has been happening, and then we're going to go a bit in depth on a few of those countries. So let's go ahead and start with Southeast Asia, as China's immediate neighbors are, from the Chinese perspective, the most important members of the BRI. If they cannot succeed in implementing things on their immediate borders, then really there is no hope of things working further on out. First one up, Thailand. Thailand was actually among the BRI's primary supporters when it was first announced back in 2013. This enthusiasm was partly due to Thailand's closer ties with China following the 2014 military coup, which that in and of itself is something that is probably another story that we need to do altogether, and Beijing's commitment to non-interference meant that its engagement with Thailand's military regime kind of became its own implicit political endorsement, something that the regime would kindly and gladly accept and would allow it to further develop more projects. And the scope of the project that we are talking about here is vast, something that makes it very challenging to just pinpoint which ones exactly are formally associated with the BRI, aside from the notable Thai-Chinese high-speed railway project. The initiative's projects range from infrastructure development, special economic zones, to promoting cultural activities. Now, of course, environmental concerns also accompany large infrastructure projects, like in the case of high-speed railways, and there have been worries about the ecological impact of some of the BRI projects in Thailand, especially in very sensitive areas, mainly due to deforestation and community displacement. The construction of the high-speed railway, especially near the ancient city of Ayutthaya, has raised concerns regarding the potential physical and visual damage to these historic sites, with many worrying that constructing the elevated track and station near certain ancient sites might risk UNESCO delisting Ayutthaya as a World Heritage Site. Kenya also has a similar situation regarding a railway, but we're going to be getting back to that here a bit later. Despite these concerns, for Thailand though, the project has been mostly seen as something that is positive. Thai citizens do overwhelmingly approve of the removal of trade tariffs that this has brought, as they can just earn more selling across the border in China or to Chinese nationals that are visiting Thailand. It is something that the more connected they have been, the better it has been for the Thais. Next up on this list, Laos. For the landlocked country of Laos, a $6 billion railway is something that is transforming the countryside rapidly, something that would give Laos the opportunity to drastically increase their export capacity. The first BRI infrastructure project, the Lao PDR China Railway, the LCR, this is something that began in 2016 and was completed in 2021. This absolute mega project would cost an approximate $6 billion and was built by Chinese state-owned contractors, which would bear around 70% of all construction costs. The railway line would run approximately 1,000 kilometers from Kunming City in China to Vientiane in Laos. The development of this railway would increase international logistic networks, and it would reduce transportation costs and time, something that was amazing for the development of business. This is something that would be seen as only generating positive economic returns. It would minimize trade costs, and it would serve as a key land transportation route in the Indochina Peninsula. The LCR project would further strengthen and deepen the relationship between these two nations. And in the first quarter of 2023, there was a significant year-on-year increase of nearly 275% in the import and export freight volumes of the Laos-China Railway. So, this is something that is improving trade. Improving trade, in fact, to such a degree that it's estimated that this railway is going to help Laos bring in over 20% more long-term aggregate income to their economy, which, so far, sounds really great, right? Well, here is where we start to see the first negative signs of the BRI. Because here's the thing. In order to get this vital railway built and pay for their share of the project, the government of Laos had to take out loans for over $1.5 billion from the Export-Import Bank of China, this being a Chinese state-owned lender. The major problem with this is that they borrowed all of this money when they were already in a massive debt. In 2021, the country's external debt stocks amounted to 90% of its GDP. And mind you, when we're talking about that, that's not its total amount of debt, that's its external debt is that high. At the time that I'm making this video, the country of Laos is dealing with surging inflation rates and no bailout is in sight. Really, the one thing that Laos does have actually going for it in the scenario is that it is a country that has always been very close to China, as they both have communist governments. So, they might receive favor favor from the Chinese when it comes to working out a deal for adjusted repayments. Aside from that, the entire situation that we're talking about here is beginning to sound more and more like what is happening in Sri Lanka, which is the next example that we're going to talk about, and the one that if you've seen any video on the BRI, Sri Lanka is the example that is oftentimes brought up to show just how predatory China is. If we go to the country of Sri Lanka, in 2022, it was suffering from shortages of food, fuel, and medicine. And while the government at the time would blame COVID, many Sri Lankans would blame the current administration of Mahinda Rajapaksa for its many dealings with China as well as other governments that effectively sold out the country. You see, my friends, China is easily the largest bilateral creditor to Sri Lanka, which in May of 2022 would become the first Asian lower middle income country to default on its sovereign debt in 2 decades. Chinese loans had financed a string of large infrastructure projects. And in the case of Sri Lanka, BRI investments had been viewed as vanity projects with very little economic feasibility. The most infamous of these, as a possible example, is the Hambantota port, something which is regarded as an absolute failure with weak economic rationales behind it and simply political ambitions to override market demands. In short, this massive port was constructed before there was ever actually any need for the port, with the idea behind it being that if we build it, they will come. Or, that products will and businesses will actually develop and people will use the port because it's there. But no, that didn't really happen. Another famous, or perhaps I should say infamous example is the Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, something that has been dubbed as the world's emptiest airport, where its operational expenditure was 21 times higher than its income. That is right, my friends. This airport was bleeding out 21 times more money than it was actually making. When it comes to all of these massive mega projects, simply no one has really been using them. And all of these projects that I've been talking about have specifically been funded by debt. Sri Lanka's debt has been soaring since 2009, when the government would embark on a borrowing-financed endeavor to enhance the country's infrastructure as it emerged from a civil war. As a supporter of the BRI from as early as 2013, Sri Lanka has frequently been depicted by Chinese critics as falling into an alleged Chinese debt trap, something that would entice it into accepting unsustainable loans for infrastructure projects and thus allowing Beijing to gain strategic or military influence by seizing assets in times of financial distress. Because, my friends, you see, this would become a very common criticism of the Belt and Road Initiative. China was essentially willing to lend any amount of money to basically any country that was involved in the BRI with little to no conditions or limitations in some cases. It essentially would do the international version of predatory lending. For a frame of reference, so that people understand what I'm talking about here, think of those payday loan places that they put all over the poorer parts of town here in the United States that give out loans, knowing that the customers that they have are going to have trouble repaying them and have very high interest rates. China, for all its intents and purposes, had to know that Sri Lanka was not really going to be able to meet the conditions of their loans. But on all of these different projects, China still goes and approves them. Why? Why would they do that? Well, as I talked about in my Chinese Economy as a Live video, there's a very simple explanation. These Chinese-funded projects are built by Chinese companies, by Chinese workers, and for the benefit of Chinese trade. If the client can't pay them back, they can just offer to take control of that project, like they did in the case of the port that we just mentioned here earlier. For you see, China really learned something very important after dealing with the British for so many years. In a move that would echo what would happen with Hong Kong, China would agree to lower the debt of Sri Lanka if Sri Lanka would agree to let it have 70% control and ownership of the port for the next 99 years, with only 30% of the profits every year actually going to Sri Lanka. Really, when looking at this, it's no wonder that many different news sources cry debt trap after this deal was made. But to be honest, when looking at this, it may be bad, and it may be predatory, yes, but Sri Lanka was already kind of doomed from the beginning. As we already talked about earlier, Sri Lanka had been borrowing a heavy amount of money since 2009, and they never should have borrowed so much from anyone in the first place, really. Bad government choices for decades have unfortunately caught up to them in the scenario. And so, as a result of that, Sri Lanka is a very notable example of what can happen when one gets involved in large projects while already being in a significant debt. As I said, it should definitely be noted here that Sri Lanka started borrowing money from China when they already owed $40 billion to other countries, primarily India, some of the G7 countries, and the IMF. At least when we talk about this, the inflation around food and other necessities has calmed down to a degree for those in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, though, incomes have yet to catch up, meaning that everyone in the country is pretty much just buying essentials, primarily at this point. It's really not a good situation. Next up on the list, Malaysia. When former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak would be ousted from office back in May of 2018, it's possible that really no one was more upset about this than officials in Beijing. After all, Najib had granted China extraordinary access to Malaysia, as across the country, huge Chinese-backed infrastructure projects were being planned or breaking ground already. But as China's presence in Malaysia would swell, a scandal would engulf the Prime Minister's office. Najib was accused of massive corruption linking to the development fund known as 1MDB, and as just one form of funneling money to the government, Razak would sign the East Coast Rail Link infrastructure deal with China, which would be part of the broader Belt and Road vision of a united Southeast Asian railway network. The scheme would become associated with a broader corruption scandal involving Razak and was ultimately then cancelled. When talking about this, it would take far too long to go over just how incredibly corrupt this guy was, but also just how incredibly lenient the punishments that he faced were. But essentially, what was happening is that he was diverting funds from all different kinds of places, and the BRI, this was just one of the places where he was stealing money from. Honestly, when we talk about this is probably a guy who deserves a video on his own, as there are a whole bunch of different corruption scandals that have broken out in recent years that would make very interesting videos. If that is something that you would like to see, let me know down in the comments section below. If I see enough people say the word corruption, well, that's what we'll go ahead and do. I mean, my friends, when we talk about this was Malaysia's biggest corruption scandal in history, which is actually impressive if you know the history of Malaysia. Since then, a number of the Chinese projects that were signed under Najib's government were scrapped, with some never even being built. This would be just one example in a long line of issues that the Belt and Road Initiative was going to face, as a research outfit by the name of the Rhodium Group would estimate that the initiative would suffer a $78 billion amount of loans go bad over the last 3 years around the world. Money would go to countries all around the world who couldn't actually afford to pay it back, or for projects that don't justify their cost, like in the case of the East Coast Rail Link. And all of this would be happening right at a time when China's own economy is slowing down, something that, considering when I had last made a video talking about the economy being a lie, is probably something that deserves its own update, because things have not been going well. So yes, Beijing would have to reevaluate the Belt and Road Initiative in Malaysia. But, that being said, Malaysia has not exactly rejected the initiative or ruled out further involvement. And so the ECRL issues that we talked about here are largely perceived as something that are a part of local corruption. In fact, a third of it is now actually being built already as they continued with the project regardless of its ties to the incredibly corrupt regime. So yeah, you do you, Malaysia. I'm sure that corruption will definitely just go ahead and fix itself with time, of course. That rail project, though, that is simply only one of several things that are happening that are questionable at best. This is not even mentioning Forest City, the massive housing project that resembles many of China's own ghost cities. Easily, this is one of the most ambitious projects by Country Garden, one of China's largest real estate development and construction firms. The city was supposed to house 1 million people, but at this time, currently houses less than 10,000 people. Country Garden also keeps saying that the project will be finished one day, but now at this time they have over $200 billion worth of debt, so considering what we know about Chinese infrastructure and housing development, that's not exactly a guarantee worth betting on. Next one up on the list, Pakistan. Easily one of the largest and most notable of the Belt and Road Initiative projects to date is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. Launched back in 2015, the CPEC is a trade corridor that would connect China's Gwadar port on the Arabian Sea with Kashgar, a city in China's western Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The project has included the construction of airports, railways, highways, and pipelines, among many different other types of trade and energy infrastructure. Total Chinese investment in this project has topped over $60 billion. Unfortunately, though, for Pakistan, the benefits of the arrangement seem to largely be in China's favor. Now, this is mostly the fault of Pakistan itself, as poor management of funds, red tape, political turmoil, security risks in Pakistan, and the pandemic have all kept China from actually pushing into its prior plan for a Phase 2 investment push in Pakistan. But to show the true dynamic power of this relationship, Pakistan would actually go and hand over the Poet of Gwadar on a 40-year lease in an arrangement where the Chinese partner would also retain 90% of its revenues. 90%! This obviously does not sit well with the local population, and in recent years there has been a severe uptick in civil and armed resistance against Belt and Road Initiative projects, particularly in Balochistan. Such resistance emanates from the environmental, social, and governance consequences of the BRI projects, which are said to negatively impact the livelihood of local communities. This has created a situation where the economic activity that is generated in Gwadar has continued to just benefit Chinese firms and workers, leading to a deep sense of hostility among locals towards Beijing. And even aside from all of that, as a common theme, something that is easily one of the most common points that we are going to have to point out in this video is that corruption has still been the biggest problem for Pakistan with the BRI. They keep having funds diverted in order to make leaders rich, and the benefits are not trickling down to the average person in the population. And to be entirely direct here, Pakistan has had the most issues with corruption regarding BRI projects, more so than any other country in the world. In essence, the BRI has failed in Pakistan because of Pakistan. Couple that with other major projects in the region being specifically built by Chinese firms and Chinese workers, and then operated by Chinese workers afterwards, means that even with the country going into debt in order to invest in the country, the actual people of Pakistan are not receiving any benefit from it. That, again, is also a thing that probably deserves its own video entirely right there. After that, Indonesia. Indonesia over the years has seen a number of different Belt and Road Initiative projects, with another recently completed project being a high-speed railway that would connect the Indonesian cities of Jakarta and Bandung. The 350-kilometer-per-hour train would open to passengers in October, and it is the first high-speed train in Southeast Asia and would cut the previously 3.5-hour trip to just a mere 45 minutes. Indonesia from this is perhaps the greatest example of Beijing practicing infrastructure diplomacy. This would be the heart of the BRI since 2008. Previously, Chinese foreign policy officials had focused on pursuing mutual connectivity projects within the frameworks of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Central Asia and the ASEAN plus 3, meaning the 10 ASEAN member states plus China, Japan, and South Korea in Southeast Asia. Today, even more impressive BRI cooperation between Beijing and Jakarta persists. Last year, Indonesia was the third largest recipient of Chinese investments with about $560 million, trailing only Saudi Arabia, which, truth be told, was an impressive $5.5 billion, but after that, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which had invested $600 million. Indonesia boasts the world's third most BRI infrastructure projects, behind Cambodia and Pakistan, though obviously we just talked about how well that has gone. However, the Indonesian government's enthusiasm for Chinese investment and BRI projects is not necessarily always matched by the public. While much has been written about the flagship Jakarta-Bandung Railway, less attention has been devoted to Indonesia's 70 other ongoing BRI projects. From the very inception of the BRI, it has been clear that Southeast Asia and its largest economy, Indonesia, these are intended to serve as the centerpiece of the massive mega project. Roughly 2/3 of all people of ethnic Chinese ancestry outside of China are in Southeast Asia. Indonesia also hosts nearly half of the 8 overseas industrial parks that China has established across the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or the, as I said earlier, ASEAN. These would be the China-Indonesia Economic and Trade Cooperation Zone, the China-Indonesia Morowali Industrial Park, and the China-Indonesia Julong Agricultural Industry Cooperation Zone. In the year 2018, both governments would agree to sign an MOU, or a Memorandum of Understanding, something to develop the Regional Comprehensive Economic Corridor. At the second Belt and Road Forum that would occur in April of 2019, Indonesia would propose 28 projects worth $91.1 billion for the wide-ranging project. Currently, the plan comprises of 4 locations on Indonesia's periphery: North Sumatra, North Kalimantan, North Sulawesi, and Bali, which aligns with Jokowi's oft-touted objective to develop the archipelago's outer provinces. In these regions, China has opened industrial parks, metallurgical and power plants, and tourism facilities. One such project, as I mentioned earlier, was the Morowali Industrial Park in central Sulawesi, which has fueled Indonesia's rise to become the world's second largest stainless steel producer, churning out 3 million tons of stainless steel every single year. The park is a joint venture between China's Xinjiang Group and Indonesia's Bintang Delapan Group that sprawls over a 3,200 hectare site designed to develop integrated nickel content stainless steel production. Since construction had started back in 2013, the area now boasts 11 smelters and $18 billion in overall investments from different companies. In addition to that staggering amount of money, Morowali also provides a rather illuminating example. The Chinese-built industrial complex has fueled misinformation about mass influxes of Chinese workers, triggering tensions with local Indonesians and also degrading the PRC's reputation. In February of 2020, 2 screenshots of Indonesian media reports would falsely claim that Morowali employed 40,000 foreign Chinese workers, and this was shared nearly 2,000 times on Twitter and Facebook. In reality, Morowali's 43,000 employees at the time included 38,000 Indonesian citizens and 5,000 workers from China. Moving on from that, as of today, the industrial park employs around 70,000 Indonesian workers. But it is a good reminder that misinformation can come from pretty much anywhere. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in January of 2023, escalating racial tensions between employees at a nickel smelter in Morowali would turn deadly, causing the deaths of 1 Chinese and 1 Indonesian worker and many more injuries. Previously, hundreds of local Indonesian workers had staged rallies and strikes, as well as burning heavy machinery and vehicles to protest the rumored attack by Chinese workers on a colleague. Afterwards, Indonesia's national police chief would say that the smelter, which employs over 1,000 skilled Chinese laborers, would increase the number of its Indonesian workers from 11,000 to 30,000. The incident would highlight the very fragile and tense person-to-person relationship that exists between Indonesia and China, which is a stark contrast to their close state-to-state ties. In addition to large-scale infrastructure projects, the BRI has also transformed Indonesia's economic engagement with China. Today, Beijing has been Indonesia's largest trading partner for 10 consecutive years. It was not always like this, though. Back in 2013, Chinese FDI in the Southeast Asian nation totaled around $300 million. And Beijing was Indonesia's 9th largest foreign investor, trailing Japan, Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia, the United Kingdom, the US, and even Taiwan. But since Xi Jinping launched the BRI back in 2013, the annual flows of Chinese investment into Indonesia have soared. In 2016, China would leap into 3rd place with $2.7 billion in FDI. By the 4th quarter of 2019, China would overtake Singapore to become the nation with the largest foreign investment in Indonesia. Due to all of this borrowing, Indonesia's debt to Chinese creditors would continue to climb, reaching $22 billion by March of 2022. But just like Pakistan and Malaysia, can you guess what the problem is that we're probably going to be seeing here next? Corruption. Lots and lots and lots of corruption. About 9 of Indonesia's BRI projects, worth an estimated $5.2 billion, involve scandals, controversies, or alleged violations. The world's 2nd most, behind only Pakistan. The amount of money that has potentially been siphoned from these projects is immense. But, that being said, that does not necessarily mean that they haven't actually done anything for the country. In fact, it would appear that among all the varying different countries that we have talked about so far or will talk about in the future, it would appear that Indonesia has been one of the countries that has actually benefited the most positively from the BRI. So, if you want to call the entire thing a debt trap, well, this isn't really the best example to use. Indonesia actually has a massive plan called Vision 2045, something to become a sovereign, fair, and prosperous country on the 100th anniversary of its independence. The plan includes becoming one of the world's top 5 economies by 2045 and reducing the poverty rate to just 0.2%, which is a wild goal for Southeast Asia. So at that point, it's really not much of a question of if China will help them actually achieve this plan, but how much will will China help them on their path to transformation? Unfortunately, like so many other projects in the BRI, it remains to be seen what is actually going to happen, whether they will fail and not actually be used, or whether everything will fall apart from corruption or not. In general, though, it is more positive than many of the other examples that we could possibly talk about. Next up on the list, we're going to be talking about not necessarily a specific country, but rather the entire region that is Africa, because a lot has been happening here. One of the key aspects about One Belt, One Road is that it also increases Beijing's control of critical global supply chains and its ability to redirect the flow of international trade. Central to these efforts are moves to open new sea lines of communication and also expand China's strategic port access around the world. Back in the year 2017, Chinese state-owned companies would announce plans to buy or secure majority stakes in 9 overseas ports, all of which were located in regions where China would plan to develop new sea lanes. This is in addition to 40 new ports in Africa, Asia, and Europe in which Chinese state-owned firms would hold stakes worth a combined $40 billion. This is a massive amount of money, but China's return on investment from increased port access and supply chains is not something that is simply about money and economics. In 5 cases, talking about Djibouti, Walvis Bay in Namibia, Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and Piraeus in Greece, well, China's port investments have been followed by regular People's Liberation Army Navy deployments and strengthened military agreements. In this way, it's not simply a matter of economic and financial investments, these are things that have been turned into geostrategic returns. Back in the year 2010, only 1/5 of the world's 50 largest deepwater ports had any kind of Chinese investment. By the year 2019, though, this had increased to 2/3. The China Ocean Shipping Company, which controls most Chinese overseas port holdings, is now the world's 4th largest shipping fleet. Beijing's merchant marine force has quadrupled since the year 2009 to become the world's 2nd largest. It now moves more global cargo than any other country on Earth. Beijing also plans to use this network of shipping routes to reduce China's dependence upon maritime choke points that could easily be contested by rivals, something that we could talk about here in the future. The PLA is locked in territorial disputes with multiple states, including Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Brunei, primarily in regards to its territorial claims in the South China Sea. This in turn raises the stakes that they could create a blockade during some kind of crisis that would in turn disrupt Chinese business objectives. In order to counter this threat, the Maritime Silk Road part of the BRI is being positioned to reroute traffic to Chinese-built port clusters in Sudan, Djibouti, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar to bypass narrow choke points in the South China Sea. The reason that I mention all of this is that most of Africa's countries' experiences with the Belt and Road Initiative have been similar to what we have talked about here in a very few key ways. First off, debates on Chinese social media tools such as Weibo and Renren suggest that it does not enjoy broad domestic support. Second, concerns are growing about economic sustainability in the countries where massive Chinese-funded infrastructure projects are being implemented, as their governments will take on more and more and more debt to try to pay for them. Third, hostility is rising in many of the countries towards policies that favor specifically Chinese workers over locals in construction and infrastructure contracts. This has been most prominent in African countries, such as in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia, just to name a few. Fourth, some of Beijing's rivals in Asia and around the world are increasingly uneasy about what they see as an effort to use the Belt and Road Initiative to try and expand upon Chinese military influence and political leverage on the continent. The common criticism that comes from this is that this is not just economic investment, this is a new form of neo-colonialism, just that of an economic kind, and that Africa is just opening the door for dependence on a larger power again, and this time they're doing so willingly. This right here is where the concept of the Chinese debt trap really gets pushed. But, to be fair, a number of these countries that we're talking about so badly need improved infrastructure that they don't really care who will help finance it as long as they can use it to improve and build their country. And if you put yourself in their shoes, it's kind of understandable that many African countries would not have such interest in borrowing from European powers course, considering past history. If you saw the previous video that we did on Senegal, where we then mentioned the whole issue with the CFA franc, then the current doubts over that are enough to show what can occur when a larger, richer power has economic power and influence over a lesser developed nation. Really, the Chinese aren't doing anything in the situation that is novel or trailblazing. They're just being a little bit more aggressive about it. As an example of desired infrastructure, the centerpiece of the Kenyan government's participation in the initiative is a high-speed railway that runs between Mombasa and Nairobi, the first high-speed railway that would exist on the entire African continent. Considering the distance that we're talking about here, this rail line would reduce the time to travel between the country's two largest cities from over 10 hours to less than 5 hours. This is massive and amazing for any developing country, particularly when it comes to any kind of real business concerns. Unfortunately, though, for anyone that is perhaps concerned with nature, conservation, and the environment, this required the building of the railway straight through the Nairobi National Park, the nation's 45-square-mile wildlife sanctuary. And while they did go and elevate the train to not disrupt the migration of animals, there is always going to be some effect to wildlife when you go and build massive projects like this, and we likely haven't really seen the effects of what is going to happen in Kenya yet. Built by the Chinese, the project has provided jobs and training for a local workforce to operate the railway, but at the same time, it has also created a serious question about the country's ability to service the Chinese loans, which paid for the railway, and Kenya's broader debt obligations to China. It also brings up the important question of whether or not the local engineers in Belt and Road Initiative countries actually have the expertise to maintain and repair these kinds of railways, or if they will continually be dependent on outsourcing that work to Chinese workers. But that, however, doesn't necessarily matter to China, at least not right now. Africa is an incredibly important end user of China's industrial overcapacities. In particular, coal, cement, steel, glass, solar, shipbuilding, and aluminum, all to use for Belt and Road Initiative projects. As an example, in Kenya, imports of Chinese cement would increase tenfold over the course of 2016, while the Nairobi-Mombasa Railway was being built. In the year 2018, Chinese exports of steel to Nigeria would rise a whopping 15%. And Algeria would triple its imports of the product. In the year 2019, China's global aluminum exports would rise by 20%, with exports to Egypt, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa all reaching a whopping $46 billion. And so considering everything that we have been talking about here, the sheer amount of investment, given the strategic nature of Chinese investments in Africa, these being ports, railways, oil and gas pipelines, power plants, all these varying different things, some African governments would view attacks on Chinese interests as being a threat to their own national security. Signed by African leaders back in 2018, the current China-Africa Action Plan would state that the security of, quote, major domestic economic projects and, quote, safety of Chinese nationals, Chinese companies, and major projects will be prioritized in intelligence, military, and police cooperation. That year, Uganda would become the first African country to deploy its military to protect Chinese interests in response to attacks on Chinese nationals by locals. In neighboring Kenya, China's security services would set up and train an elite Kenyan police division to protect the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway. These developments, of course, would set off cries of alarm in East Africa, where speculation is rife that Djibouti and Kenya, both of which are highly indebted to China, could lose their ports in a similar fashion to what happened to Pakistan and Sri Lanka. In January of 2019, Uganda's Auditor General would warn of the country's continually growing debt and the risk that conditions placed on its loans were a threat to its sovereign assets. The following month, the Kenyan Parliament would open a probe into the circumstances under which the strategic Indian Ocean port of Mombasa was being used as collateral for the loan that the government had secured from China's Exim Bank to build the Mombasa-Nairobi Railway. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, there was news of a railway to nowhere, something that would link Abuja and its airport that would emerge. The state of the railway was summarized as, quote, a line that basically avoided where people are, where people live, and where people go. From how the entire thing was planned out, there have been some political commentators that have called it, quote, the worst mass transit project on the planet. So, when we're talking about this, to put it lightly, the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa is a very complicated topic. Some infrastructure is better than no infrastructure when you're trying to modernize your country into the 21st century, but simultaneously, the degree to which this infrastructure is built, its maintenance, the possibility of predatory loans, and all of these varying different factors, it creates a very complicated picture. And that, my friends, then leads us into Europe. When it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative in Europe, it is something that is surprisingly very low-key. While China's Belt and Road Initiative is commonly associated with Central and East Asia, it has a growing footprint in Europe, with 2/3 of the EU member states now having signed on as formal partners. Prominent BRI investments have occurred in Greece, where the port of Piraeus has been refurbished and expanded by firms that are associated with the Chinese state. Portugal has had large Chinese investments in both the energy sector and its port of Signs. You have Hungary, which is home to a section of the troubled Budapest-Belgrade Railway, which is one of the Belt and Road Initiative's flagship European projects. And in Serbia, which has been a candidate for EU membership since at least 2012, China has been funding projects that reportedly violate EU environmental regulations, meaning that it is only going to create more difficulties for the actual process of becoming economically integrated. Interestingly enough, Italy would join the BRI by signing an MOU with China in 2019, and then the EU would proceed to collectively lose its mind about the decision. Italy was, mind you, the first and only country in the G7 to participate in China's Belt and Road Initiative, which many in the West would perceive as one of Beijing's attempt to try and curb the United States' global economic influence. Then, only last year in 2023, the new Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni would take power, and when she did so, she made sure to get Italy out of the Belt and Road Initiative as soon as possible, calling it, and I quote, an atrocious decision to have joined the initiative in the first place. Which brings us to a very important question. Why did Italy join the BRI and then leave? What is their reason for leaving in the first place? Well, much like many countries that would get themselves involved with the Belt and Road, the expected economic benefits of the deal did not really occur. Italy had been hoping for increased trade with China, but over the course of 2019 through 2023, Italy's imports from China would grow disproportionately in comparison to Italy's exports to China, meaning that even if trade was going on, they were spending a lot more money than they were actually getting back by trade. This would just be another instance where China was once again definitely getting the better end of the deal. So really, looking at the situation, Italy leaving is almost definitely the right move for the country, regardless of how much it pissed off Beijing by backing out of the deal. Outside of the EU, China has funded numerous different projects in the Western Balkans as well as Eastern Europe. And altogether, these investments reflect China's desire to tie itself to Europe through the expansion of railroads, airport hubs, and ports. Thanks to these investments and European demand for medical supplies in 2020, trade in goods between China and Europe was larger than trade in goods between Europe and the United States for the first time. Many products would move rapidly along expanded and heavily subsidized rail lines that would connect China and Europe, with more than 12,400 freight trains traveling between the two last year. Of course, though, once again, the balance of trade is definitely in China's favor. It's at this point in the video near the end that we now circle back to Central Asia, where the largest mismatches of power and influence really do seem to occur. Because, my friends, through the Belt and Road Initiative, China is now easily the largest investor in Central Asia. In 2022, China's trade turnover with the 5 Central Asian countries would amount to $70.2 billion, which is about 100 times more than what it was 30 years ago. Trade between China and Central Asia would grow to $89 billion in 2023, an increase of 27% from the previous year. More than $60 billion of the total was Chinese exports, with Kazakhstan trading around $41 billion with China, an increase of almost 1/3 in 2022, while Tajikistan would see a 50% uptick to $3.9 billion. It appears that China is also prioritizing the China-Europe Railway Express to deliver its goods to European markets through Central Asia. Kazakhstan's Temir Zoli National Railway Company and China's CRRC Corporation Limited, the world's largest railway transport manufacturer, would sign a $1.3 billion agreement to purchase 200 shunting and mainline diesel locomotives and to establish engineering and service centers in Kazakhstan. CRRC, which owns a whopping 50% of the global locomotive production market, plans to invest over $200 million in Kazakhstan's market. Back in 2013, when the Belt and Road Initiative was initially introduced, Kazakhstan would at that time manage to achieve its highest GDP levels. but it has yet been able to return to that peak ever since. China needs Central Asia in order to continue to expand its goals. This is a crucial detail, but then that brings up the question of why. Why do they need them so badly? Well, for one thing, resources. The Central Asian countries are some of the world's largest producers of coal, natural gas, and oil, and China is the world's largest energy consumer. So, Beijing has a vested interest in this part of the world for quite some time now. It is quite literally crucial to the state's survival. The unequal nature of this relationship exerts substantial pressure on the resource-rich Central Asian economies. China has to engage with these states for their energy needs and the consumption centers that China serves. Due to infrastructure favoring China, a reduction in China's exports could lead to a reduction in China's imports, leaving supply chains strained and export-dependent economies with limited consumer options. China's extensive spending in extraction-based economies has left these countries burdened with very significant debts. In recent years, Kazakhstan has accumulated a large sum of hidden debts, amounting to around 16% of its total GDP, and that is just its hidden debts. Tajikistan owes an estimated $3.3 billion to foreign investors, half of this being owed to China, amounting to 27% of its total GDP. By 2020, Uzbekistan's debt to China would reach $3 billion, or 20% of the country's total foreign debt. The last one, Kyrgyzstan, would have an estimated $4 billion in unpaid loans to China, an estimated 40% of its total GDP. For Kazakhstan, China promised to bring its goods to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road Initiative, but really, so far, this hasn't actually happened. This hasn't materialized. The Korgos Gateway, which is a railway that connects Kazakhstan to China and then moves to the eastern Chinese seaport, Alen-Yungang, by expressway, this was led with the intent to move Kazakh products to the Pacific. With this new railway connection, it would be expected that Kazakh products would be able to easily reach the Indo-Pacific markets. And yet, at the same time, Kazakhstan-Japanese trade has been actually declining for the past decade. Even as their own trade shrinks, China's ownership and control and extraction of Kazakhstan's natural resources, this only grows. Initially, Kazakhstan was happy to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative, as infrastructure was one of their greatest needs, and they were trying to shake off 100 years of Russian influence. While international trade hasn't exactly shown the expected results, local trade has actually flourished in the special visa-free border trading zone of the city of Korgos. This being something that was divided in half by the border itself. This zone would offer Kazakhs and Chinese the opportunity to freely trade and cross the border easily, which has actually helped the city of Korgos to grow. And this is where we find another one of the darker sides of the impact that the Belt and Road Initiative has had on these countries. Because it didn't take long for many ethnic Kazakhs to begin to travel from China back to their ancestral homeland to visit relatives or to marry Kazakhs. The Chinese government has seen this as a dangerous threat and is seeking to bring many of these Chinese-born ethnic Kazakhs back by force if necessary. These Chinese, as well as Kazakh merchants and traders who have supposedly influenced Chinese citizens negatively, have been grabbed and shoved into vehicles by Chinese security forces. This would even occur in broad daylight while being located within the special trading zone. Numerous kidnappings have occurred, with some even getting threatening phone calls from China telling them to be careful because they are being watched. But why? Why was this mingling with Kazakh society seen as something that could be dangerous? Well, the answer is Islam. The Chinese are keeping track of which Chinese-born Kazakhs are seen praying, reading a Quran, or walking into a mosque. People report having been taken to concentration camps and prison facilities without due process simply for being Muslim. This became so common and severe that at one point the only people who still were able to actually stand up and protest against this in Kazakhstan would be the wives and mothers of the people taken, demanding the release of their family members and standing outside of the Chinese consulate in Almaty. The women who are located in this place have been protesting every single day for over 2 years with no signs of stopping. And if this all sounds familiar, well, that is because it has been happening in Xinjiang province, just across the border of Pakistan and Kazakhstan, for many years. Since the year 2017, the Chinese government has been carrying out widespread and systemic abuses against the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim groups in Xinjiang. These include mass arbitrary detention, torture, enforced disappearances, mass surveillance, cultural and religious persecution, separation of families, forced labor, and violations of reproductive rights by means of forced sterilizations, among other things. Considering that I'm talking about this here on YouTube, you can imagine what has possibly been left out. Human Rights Watch in 2021 would conclude that these violations constitute, quote, crimes against humanity, while a 2022 United Nations report would come to the same conclusion. The Chinese government, as it is, discourages religious worship among the Uyghurs, and there is evidence of thousands of Uyghur mosques, including historic ones, being destroyed. According to a 2020 Australian Strategic Policy Institute report, Chinese authorities since 2017 have destroyed or damaged almost 16,000 mosques in Xinjiang. In order to forcibly assimilate them and make them Chinese, the government has arbitrarily detained more than an estimated 1 million Uyghurs in internment camps. Hundreds of thousands of children have been forcibly separated from their parents and sent to boarding schools. From 2015 to 2018, birth rates in the mostly Uyghur region of Hotan and Kashgar would fall by more than 60%, compared to a decrease of 9.69% that you would see across the entire country. There is a word that could perhaps describe what it is that I am talking about here, but again, considering this is YouTube, I'm going to leave that to your imagination. In Xinjiang, all Uyghur and Kazakh textbooks and materials are banned in schools, along with the teaching of the Uyghur and Kazakh languages. To keep a Uyghur book or speak the Uyghur language in schools is to the Chinese government a sign of separatism, an age-old excuse to punish Uyghur sentiment, pride, and consciousness. If any book is written in the Uyghur language and published in the future, there is at some point likely to be nobody who understands the language to read it within China. As it stands, it is a dying language. And all of this, everything that I've been talking about, is a part of a process that has only sped up specifically with the Belt and Road Initiative. More and more Chinese financial investment moves into these regions, specifically to connect the surrounding countries with the rest of China. Ethnic Han Chinese people are being brought in to resettle in the vacant homes and neighborhoods and towns that were left behind by the captured and disappeared Uyghurs, as well as other Turkic Muslim groups. The people themselves are being replaced. And at the same time that all of this is happening, China is currently facing economic deflation. It's facing an aging population, a shrinking workforce, a collapsing real estate market, declining relations with its biggest trading partners. Critics have been warning that as the Belt and Road Initiative develops further, China's domestic problems could rise and spill over into Belt and Road Initiative countries. Yet, despite all of this, the rising tensions between the United States and China a decade ago would prompt Beijing to drastically increase its overseas spending as it vied for influence over the so-called Global South. Contrary to common perceptions of a coordinated plan in which there is some kind of massive master plan that is supposed to take over the world, that doesn't really seem to be the case. The Belt and Road Initiative has no actual formal budget, nor does it offer any guarantees of financing to countries that sign MOUs. Rather, according to data gathered by Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, Chinese lending to Africa and Latin America started to decrease around 2016. And it was around this time that some debtors started straining under the weight of China's forthcoming credit. Venezuela stands out in particular. Since then, Chinese banks lending to the global southern countries have continued to fall, with fewer and fewer approved loans each year between 2017 and 2023. The increase in debt defaults among many of the world's poorest countries, some of which were holding unsustainable debts to China, well, this was all a likely factor. These financial headaches have started to outweigh the diplomatic gains that China would have hoped for when it originally signed off on these agreements. And as a result, there has been some speculation that the Belt and Road Initiative was winding down or phasing out. The late 2023 announcement that China would hope to commit new loans to the Belt and Road Initiative countries through the China EXIM Bank and CDB is therefore pretty surprising and significant. World leaders would gather in China in late 2023 for the third forum on the Belt and Road Initiative. As the BRI turned 10 that year, Beijing was looking to reboot Xi's signature foreign policy program amidst criticism of the debt load that it would oftentimes burden partner countries with, and also at the same time with other environmental and human concerns. In light of all these criticisms, China would at the time emphasize that the future of the BRI was supposed to be smaller and also greener projects. From that logic, no more giant, stupid, wasteful mega projects. Over the years, Chinese infrastructure projects would open sensitive environmental areas to development, increasing biodiversity loss, while dams and other changes to water flows would be putting new pressure on critical water resources. While China is also working to improve its environmental record at home, the Belt and Road Initiative has also proved to be a conduit for Beijing to export some of its most unfriendly climate technology. In addition to social displacements forced by large-scale infrastructure development, there are other human rights concerns associated with the BRI, as we've already talked about, including violations of local labor laws, among other things. The lack of transparency surrounding many Chinese projects in Belt and Road Initiative countries has fueled controversy over how China intends to use its growing economic influence. The reality is that China is still struggling to find a solution that is acceptable to all parties involved in many of the BRI countries' debt sustainability issues. A November report by AidData would find that Beijing had increased short-term emergency rescue lending. The share of rescue loans provided by China to low and middle income countries has rocketed from 5% in 2013 to 58% in 2021. In doing so, that would ensure that other major Belt and Road Initiative participants would have enough cash on hand to try and service the outstanding infrastructure project debts. At the latest forum, Xi would lay out 8 guiding principles for a new and improved, high-quality Belt and Road Initiative, aimed at strengthening the BRI's record on issues like corruption, the environment, and debt over the next 10 years. To reduce corruption, Xi would promise a new system to evaluate companies' integrity and compliance as part of a plan for integrity-based BRI cooperation. So that brings us to the end. What is the final verdict on China's Belt and Road Initiative? Well, it cannot be denied some of these projects are indeed helpful. As we discussed from the very beginning with some of their neighbors, the human rights violations that are occurring tell a story of a China that seeks to control and stamp out anything that is not praising the Chinese Communist Party. On the other side of the coin, looking at things realistically and fairly, the Western powers seem to be hell-bent on painting the entire Belt and Road Initiative as one giant debt trap ploy designed to undermine the United States' economic power and influence. And to that, I say, it's China. That's kind of been their whole goal for the past quarter of a century now. To act like this series of projects doesn't actually help provide some positive results is, well, that's ignorant at best and intentionally misleading at worst. But at the same time, to deny that China won't use every single opportunity to try and become the world's next greatest superpower, whether they are successful or not, and whether or not the other countries around them are sidelined or not, well, that would be naive and foolish. Every country has to decide its path moving forward into the middle of the 21st century. For some, continuing to stay supported by the Western allies will be their path forward. Others will try new routes of success, and some of those roads may in turn lead to China. Only time will tell, but for many, as the Chinese economy falters, that may turn out worse than they had hoped. Everyone, thank you for watching. This has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. I appreciate all of you. If you could go ahead and like, comment, and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate it. And also make sure to check out the links down in my description below. If you want to travel with me, if you want to do any of these things, if you want to check out my coffee, anything and everything that you all do to help me with my videos is something that helps me produce more of them for you all. Thank you, my friends, and I will see you next time. Goodbye, everyone.